so much, Mr. John, for that very warm introduction. It's so good to see many old friends here and students, and wonderful to be able to speak with you tonight. I do have to say, however, that this subject is difficult. It's hard to talk about this. Hard to talk about it for a couple of reasons. One, because it's just so painful. It's so catastrophic, the division of Korea that has lasted just this unimaginably long 70 years. It's also difficult because it's complicated. You know, it's not a straightforward narrative. Mostly, as Mr. Jung suggested, what I've lectured about over the years has been the war of 1950 to 53. And actually, that's a more straightforward subject. Also very, very difficult and painful, but a clearer kind of straight storyline. This is not. And so it's really difficult to try to kind of get our minds around how this terrible result happened out of a collection of circumstances and decisions and actions. And then finally, it's difficult because in Korea, this story is also the foundation of the Republic of Korea. And it makes a distinctly unsatisfying, creation myth. Any country has to have a kind of good story to teach kids when they're in middle school about how the country was founded and admirable statesmen who played a role in founding the country. Every country needs this and creates this. And so in Korea, there has been a story created to serve that function. But what it has done is to create this kind of simple narrative out of something that's not a simple narrative, and in the process really distorting the history. So my argument tonight is that it would be better to see the situation more clearly. It would be better for Korea in the current stage of its development. Closer?
Oh, closer, yeah.
Oh, that is louder, okay. So that's what my particular bias is. It's good to look clearly at things, even when they are difficult and complicated. So I'll try my best in an hour to outline the basic stages, the most important stages, as best I can reconstruct them in how this came about. So it starts with the conditions of the Japanese Empire. This is a map of it at its height. So Japan began with taking Formosa, Taiwan in 1895, then it took Korea, 1910, moved into Manchuria, 1931, made a separate state out of that, ruled it through a puppet government, and then 1937 moved into China, into North China and on down, took control of a large segment of China. So at that point, the Chinese army fought the Japanese. It was a very large army of the Republic of China under Chiang Kai-shek. But it was not a modern army. It was not terribly effective. So even though it had enormous superiority in manpower to the Japanese, they were not able to defeat the Japanese forces in China. They were able to keep them from taking over the rest of China. And for the remainder of the period until 1945, they did keep about 500,000 Japanese soldiers tied down in China. which was helpful. But the Chinese army was not in a position to defeat the Japanese army, which was much more modern, much more powerful. Then in 1941, the Japanese made a very big mistake of moving into Southeast Asia.
Hold the mic closer.
Moving into Southeast Asia, and at the same time attacking the United States so that the United States wouldn't prevent them from moving into Southeast Asia. Well, that was too much. Once the American military forces joined in, so that was the beginning of the end. But the way it worked out was that the Americans began in the south, right, making a united command together with the Australians, and they had to move north, right, gradually. Very, very tough fighting in Indonesia, New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, on up Carolina Islands, Philippines, on out. Very, very difficult. War from 1941 to 1945. Very, very hard fighting. So, just looking at this map, something becomes clear. When we think about the other theater of the war, which was in Europe. So Japan was allied with Germany, and therefore when Japan attacked the United States and the U.S. declared war on Japan, U.S. was automatically also at war with Germany and a part of the ongoing war in Europe. Now, in Europe, as this map shows, Germany managed to gain control over almost all of Europe, extraordinary amount, and North Africa. They moved into Russia all the way to the outskirts of Moscow. Here's Moscow right there. Actually, if you go to Sheremetyevo Airport, you go to Moscow that way. Driving from Sheremetyevo into the city, now you pass a monument showing the line of the maximum advance of German forces. So they got to between the airport and the city in today's times. All right, so the Soviets then became the allies of the British when Germany invaded Soviet Union. And therefore, also in December 41 were the allies of the United States. So, back to this map. As the Americans were moving north, it was pretty clear that it would be very difficult for them to reach Manchuria. You can see that, right? Which was the center of the Japanese war industry. And Northern Korea was likewise the center of the Japanese war industry. Very massive industrial facilities built in the 1930s. But as long as the Japan islands themselves, the Japanese home islands, were still under the control of the Japanese government, it's very difficult for the U.S. Army to reach Korea or Manchuria. But what about the Soviet Union? It's very easy, right? The Trans-Siberian Railroad runs just along that border of Manchuria, going down to Vladivostok. The Soviets could simply move overland from Siberia down into Manchuria and take care of the very sizable and important, powerful Japanese army in Manchuria, and then move down into Korea. Our simple geographical situation. So because of that, the Americans pressed the Soviets to enter the war against Japan, beginning the day after Pearl Harbor. So, because they needed their help to defeat Japan. this is setting the stage for the Soviet entry into Korea. Now, the Soviets had been involved in Northeast Asia since the middle of the 19th century and heavily since the 1890s. But as long as they were still fighting Germany in the West, they were not even going to discuss entering the war with Japan. The war against Germany was a fight for basic survival. It was unimaginably difficult. And so they wouldn't even talk about entering the war against Japan until it became clear that Germany was about to be defeated. And that became clear in early 1945. And so the Soviets began to discuss what it would involve for them to enter the war against Japan. The Americans and the British asked them what they would require by way of territorial gains in exchange for entering the war. What they asked for was a return of the territories that they had lost to Japan in the War of 1904-05, which was just 40 years before, well within the lifetime of the senior officials at that time. So they wanted southern Sakhalin Island, right here, which had been Russian and taken by Japan in 1905. They wanted they wanted the Kuriles, this chain of islands. You can see from the map why they wanted the Kuriles. Because the Kuriles can block the Soviet coast, preventing ships from getting out to the Pacific. So very important to control the Kuril Islands. And then Russia, in the 1890s, had built a railroad in Manchuria going to Vladivostok, and with a branch going down to the tip of that peninsula, where they developed a commercial port and Dairen, and a military port, a naval base, Port Arthur. Both of those were very important. Their main port on the Pacific, Vladivostok, right here near the Korean border, is iced in the wintertime. And so these two ports in Manchuria were the alternative to Vladivostok. They were essential for the Soviet Navy and also for commercial purposes. So the Soviets wanted to get back their control over the railroad and the ports. They knew that Manchuria would return to Chinese control. It was part of China. But they wanted to be able to have access to the railroads and ports. So those were their demands. They didn't say anything about Korea. Russia had been involved in Korea. The turn of the century, it had control over Chennai Naval Base. Various kinds of involvement, but it was never as important to the Russians as Manchuria was. You see from the map the way Manchuria is so important geographically, right, to Russia. All right. Their one concern about Korea was that it not be used as a bridge from Japan to the Asian mainland. So their concern was that whatever government would be created in Korea after the war, after the Japanese government in Korea was done away with, whatever new government in Korea would be established would have to be friendly to the Soviet Union so that it would not allow a resurgent Japan to use the Korean peninsula to reach the Soviet Far East. Most people aren't aware, it seems, at least in my experience, that Japan occupied most of Siberia for 4 years after World War I, during World War I. from 1918 to 1922. The Japanese seriously considered moving into Siberia in the 30s to get oil from Siberia instead of down south in Southeast Asia. So I knew it was a very real threat. Stalin in particular was terrified of the threat from Japan throughout the 1930s. And so his concern was that Korea not allow a resurgent Japan, a newly militarized Japan, to again attack the Soviet Far East. Now, the American idea was more complicated and sort of strange. Roosevelt embraced eventually the idea of trusteeship for Korea. He was interested in establishing trusteeships for a number of places after the war. This was because Roosevelt's primary concern was to prevent another conflict from emerging after the end of the terrible Second World War. The Second World War came only 20 years after the First World War. So the leaders at the time were aware they had to do a better job. We need not do this every 20 years. So in Roosevelt's mind, the way to do that was to establish international cooperation among the great powers. And as he looked at the situation in the world during the war, first of all of the areas in red here, quite a lot of territory. Once it would be liberated from Germany, something would have to happen. Right? There would have to be a new government created. That's a perfect, recipe for conflict. When there is a vacuum of power in an important area, big powers will move in to try to get advantage. Also, the local people will begin fighting one another to establish control. Same here. All of Southeast Asia would be very, very suspicious of the whole idea of trusteeship. Refused to talk about it, even. Very, very opposed to it. So it was talked about only in a private discussion between the American leader and the Soviet leader. Okay, moving on to the summer of 45. Germany was defeated in May. So immediately the Soviets started massing huge number of forces. They massed about 1.5 million men along the Trans-Siberian Railroad just north of Manchuria, preparing to move them in. But at the same time, after the Yalta Conference, this idea of cooperating with the Soviets after the war began to fray because of Soviet actions in the territories in Europe that it occupied, particularly Poland. As you probably are aware, when the Red Army moved into Eastern Europe on the way to defeating Germany, it set up its own style government against the wishes of the people of those areas. In Poland in particular, Poland had a government in exile in London. When it returned to Poland, it was simply arrested by the Soviet secret forces and never seen again. So Soviet behavior in Eastern Europe was very alarming to the Americans, to the British, and to all the other Western leaders. So things got more complicated. Then in April, Roosevelt died and a new president came to office in the United States, Harry S. Truman. He and his advisors began to reconsider the idea of Soviet entry into the war, began to regarded as desirable that the Soviets not enter the war against Japan. By that time, the war had proceeded quite well for the Allied forces. But they were in particular simply worried about the political consequences for Northeast Asia, as, worried that the same thing would happen there as happened in Eastern Europe. However, the military leadership in the United States was still focused exclusively on defeating Japan. And so it continued to want the Soviets in the war because that was so beneficial militarily. So there was a dispute within the American leadership. Then, the American development of an atomic bomb was nearing completion, and that gave President Truman and some of his advisors, in any case, the idea that the bomb could make it not necessary for the Soviets to enter the war. If we can use the bomb against Japan, we can bring about the end of the war before the Soviets entered. Right? So that seemed a rather hopeful way of solving this problem. Not hopeful for the victims of the bomb, but hopeful in terms of the politics of Northeast Asia. The Soviets knew that this was the change of mind in the American leadership because they had plenty of spies. And so, in August, well, late July and on into August, what happened was a race. It was a race. Could the Soviets enter and get what they wanted to get out of fighting against Japan, or would the war end first, before the Soviets could get there? Because the only way the Americans were going to occupy Korea and Manchuria was if the war ended first. As long as Kyushu was in Japanese hands, it was too difficult to land forces in Pusan. You can see that quite simply, right? Not to mention getting all the way up to Manchuria. In July, the big three allies met again in a suburb of Berlin called Potsdam. This building is a museum now. If you go to Berlin, you can go visit it. It's interesting to see. This is also the inspiration for the beautiful painting that was up in the first slide and up for the advertisement for this talk by So Young-sun, who's a painter who works just north of Seoul, has done a wonderful series of paintings on the Korean War, including that one on the Potsdam Conference. All right, so here they are, sitting around a big round table. Truman learned that the test of the atomic bomb was successful on the very first day of the conference in Potsdam. However, as his advisors pointed it out, quite realistically, the Soviets could still cross into Manchuria and Korea, even, no matter what, right? Even if the war ended, right? So they had to begin contingency planning. Right? So various ideas were proposed. One was to quickly make landings, go back to our map again, quickly make landings on the Liaodong Peninsula in Manchuria to at least secure those ports and move into Manchuria as much as possible so the Soviets wouldn't take Manchuria away from China. Also to land some forces in Korea some way, and to somehow get as far north in Korea as possible. if the Soviets were barreling down from the north. So these discussions were being held within the American leadership during the Potsdam Conference, but they were not discussed between the Americans and the Soviets at all. The most prevalent theory that I hear in Korea about how the division happened is that there was a secret deal between the Americans and the Soviets at the Potsdam Conference to divide Korea. First of all, we have the records of that conference, both from the Soviet side and the American side. We know that that didn't happen, and we have memoirs of many participants. But also, there was no logic to that. All right. We should stop, however, here and ask why was the United States so eager that Korea not fall under Soviet control? Well, I would like to be able to say it was, out of concern for the welfare of the people of Korea. But that was actually not it. A government of a country and a military leadership of a country has to, above all, protect the interest of their own country. That's their job. And so that was the thinking behind this. The reasoning was, again, it's clear from the map. These students get tired of me saying that all the time. Just look at the map. But Japan had a communist party that was, more or less strong. The Americans were worried that if all of Korea came under control of the Soviets, that would empower the Communist Party in Japan. That would endanger Japan. All right? It would make it more likely that Japan itself would come under control of the Soviets. Now, why is that such a big deal? You have to step back a little bit and look at the big picture. The world in 1945 had 5 centers of war-making capacity that were large enough to start a new world war. Starting in North America, the US. Moving across the Atlantic, we come to the UK. Germany's in bad shape at the end of the war. Nonetheless, it can revive and again develop war-making capacity. Moving eastward, it's the Soviet Union. Enormous war-making capacity by the end of the war. And then Japan, in the same situation as Germany, badly damaged, but can be restored. Well, that's 5 centers, all right? The Soviets would be hostile to the Americans and the British by definition. They saw themselves engaged in a very endless and essential struggle against the capitalist powers. So that's 1, 2, and 3. What would happen to Germany and Japan if Germany's war-making capacity was added to the Soviets? That would give it really a disturbing amount of power against which the Americans and the British would be hard pressed to defend. And if the Soviets gained control of Japan, the same thing. So for the Americans and the British, the most important issue was to prevent Japan and Germany from coming under control of the Soviet Union. So that's why Korea became important. So for both sides, Korea was important because of Japan, because of their fears of what might happen in Japan. to the Potsdam Conference, there was no discussion of trusteeship at all because of British objections. Churchill started screaming whenever the word emerged, so it was not talked about at all. Instead, the only agreement that was reached at Potsdam was in conversations between Soviet and American military leadership, because as the Soviets planned to move down into Manchuria and enter the war against Japan, they obviously had to coordinate with the American military, decide who was going to be where. So they agreed that Korea would be the Soviet zone for ground operations. It would be the American zone up, except for the far northeast corner, for naval and air operations, because American naval and air power was much stronger coming up from the south. But it would be in the Soviet zone for ground operations. All right, so that was the agreement at Potsdam. That was the only agreement. All of Korea would be in the Soviet zone for ground operations against the Japanese forces in Korea. Then, soon after the Potsdam Conference, the atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviets moved up their entry date. They were planning to enter on August 15. They moved it up to August 9 because of the bombs, desperate to get in there before the war ended. Following the Soviet entry into the war, the Japanese informed the Americans they were preparing to surrender. There's very interesting discussion right now among historians about the relative role of the bombs and the Soviet entry into the war in bringing about Japanese surrender. It's clear it was both. The Japanese knew they really couldn't deal with these 1.5 million soldiers coming across the border into Manchuria, and they were terrified of the prospect of being occupied by the Soviet Union at the end of the war. And so the thinking among the political leaders in Japan was they better surrender so they can surrender to the Americans. So that prompted Japan's decision to surrender. So at that point, then the Americans began drafting what was called General Order Number 1 to organize the surrender, or receive the surrender of Japanese forces. This enormous territory, you see here in red, had Japanese forces. It's no small thing to accept the surrender of an army at the end of a long war. Their weapons have to be collected, the men have to be secured, they have to be shipped back, order has to be maintained, property has to be dealt with. There's a lot to do. So that had to be organized, it had to be planned. Here's MacArthur accepting the surrender of the Japanese. Order number 1 had to then include something about Korea. So at that point, the American advisors who were concerned about Soviet control over the entire peninsula, came to the fore and decided to include in order number 1 a point. It was a very long order, governing everything from Burma to the Kuriil Islands. But one point had to do with Korea, and this was to say that Soviet forces would accept the surrender of Japanese forces north of the 38th parallel, and American forces would accept the surrender south of the 38th parallel. This was was decided at Potsdam just a couple of weeks before. This is something new. Right? Stalin made two comments about General Order Number 1, the draft that he received, but neither of them had to do with this sudden decision, to have two occupation zones in Korea. One was to request an occupation zone in Hokkaido, northern Hokkaido, to be Soviet occupation zone. Again, his chief concern, of course, was Japan, what would happen in Japan after the war. The other was to assign all of the Kuriles to the Soviet Union, and not, including the four southernmost ones, the ones that are still the dispute between Japan and Russia. So he said nothing about Korea. We don't have documentary evidence for his thinking about this proposed division in Korea, but I think from looking at the whole scenario, then he did it because he wanted to reserve his negotiating leverage for Hokkaido. Number one goal is Japan, so he wants to be sure and get as big a role in the post-war rule of Japan as possible. Therefore, he was willing to give the Americans something in Korea in hopes that they would do the same in Japan. So, I should stop at this point and say, the alternative to division at the 38th parallel was all of Korea to be in the Soviet zone. If that happened, Korea would have been like Poland. The only way it would have been occupied by the Americans is if the Soviets never entered the war. All right. There was another conference in London in September of 1945, but they didn't discuss. The Soviets continued to press for a greater role in the occupation of Japan. And while they were doing that, they began to solidify their control over their zone north of the 38th parallel in Korea. Here's the young Kim Il-sung and a group of Soviet officers. The Soviets were very organized in managing affairs in North Korea. They brought a group of Koreans from Soviet Central Asia to serve as go-betweens. They organized a separate party organization in the north in the fall of 1945, and then suppressed the non-communist parties. And then by the end of the fall, very, very quickly, they organized a provisional government. They had departments for industry, transport, finance, agriculture and forestry, communications, trade, health, justice, and police. Each of them was headed by a Soviet advisor who had the final voice in all decisions. So they were moving really rapidly to create a government for their zone. The Americans, on the other hand, were extremely disorganized and extremely ineffective. Here is General MacArthur meeting with Yi Seung-man. This is a little bit later, but the picture shows how the Americans did turn to Yi Seung-man and others who spoke English and were very conservative to create some kind of advisory council. They disbanded a group called the Korean People's Republic that was created by political activists, mostly on the left, here in Seoul, as soon as Japan surrendered. But aside from establishing military rule of the southern zone, alone, the Americans were not at all sure what they were going to do because this trusteeship idea was still out there. And they thought they somehow needed to cooperate with the Soviets and they shouldn't create a government until they did that. Finally, in late November, the Soviets gave up on the Japan issue. The Americans were really intransigent. They weren't going to give the Soviets anything. And so then they were ready to turn to Korea. So there was another conference, this one in Moscow in December, of Allied foreign ministers. That's Molotov in the center, the Soviet foreign minister, and on his right is the British foreign secretary, and on his left is the American secretary of state. It was at this conference, once the Japan issue was resolved, that the two finally worked out some kind of plan for this trusteeship thing. The plan was there would be a joint Soviet-American commission, would meet in Seoul, March of 1946. It would consult with Korean democratic parties and social organizations. That was the term. That's a Soviet term. Democratic parties and social organizations. After consulting with them, they would create a provisional government, and then this provisional government would later hold elections for a new permanent government for Korea. Now, both the Americans and the Soviets by this time, however, had a dilemma with regard to this trusteeship thing. The Soviets felt they needed to preserve the appearance of cooperation with the Americans because they had to cooperate with them everywhere from North Africa to, Finland to Iran to, Southeast Asia to Northeast Asia. There was a great deal of land in dispute, great deal of issues. Also, they were hoping for economic aid from the United States. So they had to preserve the appearance of cooperation with the United States. But at the same time, they had to be sure that whatever government was created in Korea would be friendly. And the only way it would be friendly would be if it were communist or at least mostly communist. The Americans by that time, as I already mentioned, were determined that Korea not be communist, not come under the control of the Soviets out of concern of for what that would mean for Japan. So, the likelihood that this joint commission would ever actually create a government for Korea was very low. And indeed, what happened is that when it met in March of 1946, the Soviets insisted that the only political parties and social organizations that the Joint Commission would consult with would be ones who supported the Moscow Conference decision on Korea, on trusteeship. The reason they made that condition is that when the Moscow Conference decision was announced in newspapers here in Seoul and throughout the Southern Zone, there was intense opposition, you can imagine. The idea of trusteeship was, of course, insulting to Korean political leaders. They assumed that once Japanese forces were done away with, the Korean political leaders would themselves create a new government for their country, and they were quite outraged by this idea that the occupying powers would not do that, would try to control the process. So the Soviets, seeing this opposition in the South, quickly called the leadership of the Korean Communist Party to the North for consultations, instructed them, and we have the records of this from the archives, to support the Moscow Conference decision. So, in those days, any Communist Party followed orders from Moscow. That's what you did. All right? So they faithfully returned to Seoul and voiced support for the Moscow Conference decision. They were the only group doing that. Therefore, when the Joint Commission met, it could say, we will only consult with people who support the duly reached agreement between the Soviets and the Americans on trusteeship in Moscow. It's kind of lame, as young people say, but that was the strategy. So, when the Joint Commission met, this was announced by the Soviets. The Americans said, that's ridiculous. We must consult with an entire range of political parties. The Soviets said, oh, we must consult only with those who support the Moscow Conference decision. The Americans said, that's absurd. The Soviets said, no, we must only consult with. So they did this, back and forth for several weeks, got nowhere. Finally, the Joint Commission disbanded in May, not having accomplished anything. It met again for a little bit in 1947, still didn't accomplish anything. So in 1948, the US turned the issue over to the United Nations. The United Nations announced that it would hold elections in Korea for a new government. The Soviets were, of course, not going to give up their control of the northern half, so they refused to allow the elections to be held there. So they were held only in the south. Republic of Korea was created from those elections in August of 1945 as the government for all of Korea. The communist leadership in the north couldn't let that stand without doing something, so the next month they declared the establishment of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea as the government for all of Korea. Seoul was the capital of the DPRK in its first constitution. So that's how it happened.
So, Professor Weathersby can entertain two questions from the floor.
North Korea insists.
Wait, just a minute, Jacob.
You have a big voice, a little music.
Professor Weathersby, thank you very much for your excellent presentation. It's fascinating for all of us. One question that I have which rarely gets discussed is how and why did the Allied powers come to decide that Korea should be cut free from Japan at all? Given that Japan hadn't taken Korea recently, it wasn't part of its World War II spoils, it had been agreed after World War I that Korea was well and truly part of Japan. So why did the Allied powers decide to sort of turn back the clock 30 years and say, now we're going to take this from you as well? Is there any information about that?
Oh, that's an interesting question. It basically was just that Japan was to be deprived of its war-making capacity, and that would include then all the territories that it had seized with all of their resources. Northern Korea was a very important resource for the Japanese war machine. But also there was just a kind of general principle. The same had applied after World War I. I mean, Turkey was deprived of its empire even though in the Middle East, even though it had ruled that area for 400 years. Austria was deprived of its empire in Central Europe, even though it had ruled it for some hundreds of years. So there was the idea that an aggressive power would suffer the consequence of losing its empire.
Okay.
North Korea insists.
Okay.
Yeah, well, there's only so much time here.
But of course, there the British mindless wheels of Whitehall was still thinking like 1904 or thereabouts, and that somehow Korea to Japan was as India was to the UK. So,
Yes.
as I remember, the idea about where it was discovered what happened to Korea, Churchill said, in due course.
That's right. This is another complicating factor that actually I didn't mention, which is that the British were very worried about losing India. And of course they did lose India 2 years after the end of the war. And so decolonization, taking away an empire, also was problematical for the British ally. And that made it sort of pretty tricky between the Americans and the British. And so that, on top of the fact that there was no government in exile for Korea that was recognized by the other powers. There was a group in China that called itself the Korean Provisional Government. Everyone here who's Korean knows them very well, because one of the things the ROK has done is to position its origin in the group that called itself Korean Provisional Government. And so I know from my students that there's a very exaggerated idea of what the KPG was and what it did. But in actuality, it was not a government. It had never ruled, it had no jurisdiction. None of the people involved in it had ever been in a government. I mean, the government had been the Joseon dynasty, of course. So, and moreover, the Korean Provisional Government was very sharply divided into factions. It was unable to operate effectively, politically or militarily. And therefore, there was the idea that there would have to be a kind of temporary administration of Korea. They couldn't simply hand it over to some group. There wasn't a group, qualified to do that. And so that was part of the in due course agreement at Cairo as well.
We should let this sentence.
Okay.
And North Korea insists that the Korean War was aggression by U.S. and South forces.
Yeah, that's a different subject. So we'll stick on the subject of division, 1945-46.
Thank you. I enjoyed the speech very much. I have a very quick question. I was wondering, you described earlier how the U.S. put the election into the hands of the UN, and then the Soviet Union did not allow that election to take place in North Korea. Did the U.S. think that the outcome of the election would have been a non-communist government? Is that why they allowed that to proceed in the South?
No, they just wanted to get rid of the problem. The same as the British did with Palestine. Turn it over to the UN. I mean, that's why the UN was created, to solve such problems. So let's let them deal with it. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could comment a bit more about the dispute now. Historians, you mentioned it briefly about the atomic bombs and the Soviet entry in terms of the impact on Japan's surrender. I was just wondering if you could comment on your view on that recent controversy.
You mean on whether it was the bomb or
Yeah.
the Soviet entry?
Yeah.
There's a very good book that was published about 10 years ago by a Japanese-American historian named Toshi Hasegawa at UC Santa Barbara, who uses Japanese sources, Russian sources, and American sources, and does what I think is a brilliant job of tracing this desperate race at the end of the war. His argument is that the entry of the Soviets played a much bigger role than has generally been acknowledged. The American side has a natural tendency to put more emphasis on the bomb because that's what we did. That must have been the most important thing. Also, there's a need to justify the use of the terrible weapons. So this narrative in the U.S. is, yes, the weapons were terrible, but they had to be used in order to bring the war to an end. And it interferes with that narrative to say, oh, really, it was so. So, it's ongoing, but certainly I think Hasegawa's work has persuaded people that the Soviet entry into the war played a very important role.
It seems like Roosevelt's advocacy of this trusteeship idea really befuddled things and caused a lot of confusion. Was there any significant pushback against that from within the American bureaucracy?
Yes, there was. And again, we have a number of very good accounts of this in the scholarly literature. There were certainly some, particularly in the State Department, who thought that was quite unrealistic idea, and faulted Roosevelt for overconfidence in his ability to engage in personal diplomacy, to take care of problems through the force of his mind and his will and his charm. And I think that's a realistic criticism on their part. And so that's why we see as soon as Truman became president, the movement against trusteeship became much stronger. Graduate student here also. Anyway, whenever that gets organized, yeah.
Okay, I'll ask that privately then.
Yeah.
But it is clear that Syngman Rhee, there was...
Yeah, so the return of Syngman Rhee is very interesting, yeah, because he was regarded as a pain in the neck on the part of most of the people in the American government, because he had been lobbying them for years and years and years to recognize the Korean provisional government. But eventually, the forces who were favorable toward Rhee, in particular Preston Goodfellow, who had been with the Secret Service, the OSS, successfully lobbied for his return, and so he returned. He was brought on an American plane. Yeah.
Thank you for your lecture. My question too. As an expert, is there a possibility for the Soviet Union not to open their documents concerning the 38th terror? And second question is, if the United States had agreed with the Soviet Union concerning Japanese territory, would the Stalin have permitted
Okay, would he have gotten his way?
invasion of
Yeah,
the
yeah.
peninsula?
I don't know. That's a counterfactual, and it's impossible to answer. We don't know. If the Americans had let the Soviets take Hokkaido or northern Hokkaido, then what would have happened? Don't know. But I do want to emphasize that this was all happening very, very fast. Very, very fast in the context of the end of this enormous war against an enormous enemy. Huge armies involved, huge stakes involved, and all of these things were changing and happening very, very quickly. So I think that's just really important to keep in mind in trying to get a clear view of what happened. Your first question about Soviet documents on 38th parallel, We do know that he gave an order to the army, to the Soviet army, to stop at the 38th parallel and even to pull back to that line if they had already crossed it, and they did. Americans didn't get to Korea until September 8th, and the Soviets got in on, August 10, so that was almost a month later. The Soviets could very easily have just marched all the way down to Busan, but he ordered them to halt. Beyond that, it's possible that something might turn up where, in which Stalin explains that, but there would have to be a conversation he had with Molotov or some such person explaining why he decided to do that, but it hasn't turned up yet.
Okay, what last question?
I love it when I get the last question. Thank you very much for your presentation. The question about Isunman sparked a question about Kim Il-sung. I read probably a decade ago, I think it was Brad Martin that first wrote about how Kim Il-sung actually didn't want to leave his nice cozy home on a Soviet military base and come down and try to run a mess of a country. And I was just wondering if you had found anything that would substantiate that in Soviet archives.
No, I haven't found the records of his time at that camp outside Weathersby. I wish I had. The military archive is still largely unmined. It's, enormous. The archive of the Ministry of Defense, you can imagine how huge that is. So perhaps we will get to it. I would really like to get those records. Yeah, they haven't emerged. I can't imagine, though, that Kim Il-sung wasn't eager to return to Korea. That seems like a strange idea that he would have wanted to stay in the Soviet Union. North Korea was nice and safe by that time. It was under the control of the Soviet army. So given the chance to go back and lead his country, of course. That was, the goal of his life was to bring communist revolution to his homeland. So it was an incredible, stroke of good fortune for him to be able to do that, protected by the Soviet army.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Kathryn, and thank you everybody for coming to CRAS.